primary control with critical vehicle function.
Welcome to Future Thinking episode 116. My name is Alexander Schatten and I'm delighted to introduce the conversation with Professor Jessica Weinkle. Today's episode is titled Science and Politics. Jessica Weinkle is Associate Professor of Public Policy at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and a Senior Fellow at the Breakthrough Institute. She contributes insightful articles to the Journal of Breakthrough Institute as well as on her Substack. By the way, I highly recommend checking out her work, subscribing to her Substack especially, or following her on X. In this episode, Jessica and I delve into ecomodernism, what does it mean and what are its implications, the risk of simplifying complex systems, so for instance, how using simple indicators can mislead our understanding of complex issues, psychological impacts of exaggerated reporting, addressing issues like climate anxiety, for instance, the intersection of activism, politics and science, political stances by scientific organizations. So is it appropriate for scientific bodies or publishers to endorse political candidates in events like presidential elections, for instance, the role of experts in society, and also applying models of complex systems. So what are best practices and pitfalls to avoid, among other topics. If you enjoy this ad-free podcast, I have two simple requests. The first is, please rate this episode positively on your preferred platform. And secondly, share it on your social networks and recommend it to colleagues, friends, and family. Furthermore, make sure to subscribe to the podcast via your podcast app to be able to catch up on all my excellent past episodes and to stay updated with future releases. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the conversation with Jessica Weinkle. Jessica, thank you very much for taking time for a conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm looking forward to it.
I would like to talk with you a little bit about science and politics and also in realm of environmental matters. And I don't know, is it fair to say that you would identify yourself as an eco-modernist in the way how you would see your position to environmentalism?
Yeah, I think so these days. That is the way I see it. I think in the past, I wouldn't have labeled myself as such, only because I'm like hesitant about labels in general. But as I've been working with Breakthrough over the last year and reading more and understanding the core arguments that they have proposed, I definitely believe strongly that that is a good way to go. And so, yeah, I see myself as an eco-modernist these days.
That, of course, begs the question, what is eco-modernism?
I think, so the way I understand it, the analogy that keeps coming into my mind is when you're, let's say, like mountain biking, you got to look where you want to go, not look at what you don't want to hit. Because if you keep looking at what you don't want to hit, that's what you're going to do. You're going to hit the thing. So eco-modernism is looking more positively at all the ways that we can accomplish our goals with a base appreciation for bringing the environment and ecology and those sorts of values, that ecological well-being is best achieved when people have wealth and well-being and they're cared for and they feel secure. And that is a means towards achieving other environmental goals and using our technologies to ensure that people have access to energy and involve our energy where people have the wealth to do so. It's not a movement of can'ts, like we can't bring people up. We can't have access to material goods. We can't have access to energy. That gets us nowhere. Nobody likes it. It doesn't feel good. And so it's looking where you want to go and trying to consider all the ways that you can get there and bringing economic development and stability for people forward as well.
It also seems to be a more, let's say, technology open approach, let's put it like this, opposed to, my feeling is a lot of environmentalists seem to be rather hostile to technology. Maybe this is a bit simplistic, but does this make sort of sense to you?
I I don't know. They're very like selective. It seems like these technologies are good. But then I've also seen that there's a lot of hesitation. It's the idea of the technology, but then the simultaneous fighting against implementing it. I've seen stuff where there's a lot of concerns about the regulation in the ability of, let's say, kind of the regulatory environment that allows too many opportunities to say we can't. So you have groups saying, well, we want solar, we want wind, we want even those that say they want nuclear. And then you have the regulatory piece that allows for the same people to say, oh, we can't do those things because it's going to hurt this forest or that thing or whatever. And so it's just like it's a muddle.
The second thing you mentioned before, like you said, like achieving goals in some sort of sense, like environmental goals or something like that. That of course opens the question like, okay, but how would you define what reasonable goals are, or to put it the other way around, how would you assess the situation? And my feeling is that there are a number of like examples of assessing the situation. For instance, the IPCC would be one framework to assess a particular type of environmental situation, let's say climate in that case, or planetary boundaries is another approach to try to assess the situation. How do you feel about these approaches in general and maybe also in particular?
It kind of goes back to the beginning, right? Like the environmental goal is not really a way to achieve the things that we need to achieve the environmental goal. So if you want to have that like holistic ecological well-being, the goal cannot be that. The goal has to be bringing people the well-being through wealth and healthcare and all that other stuff so that they have the opportunity to want those things too. Right now, if people are worried about the cost of energy, if people are worried about the cost of food, if people are worried about those sort of basic things where they feel they're being left behind, whether it's in the United States or another country, then they're not going to really be all that concerned about sort of theoretical ideas about how our global ecology should look. They're worried about more practical day-to-day problems that they have.
Nonetheless, I guess you want to have some assessment of where we are standing environmentally, as you want like assessment how you stand economically and so on. And so what are your ideas? For instance, the planetary boundaries are quite a popular scheme at the moment, or approach at the moment. Yeah. IPCC, how do you see these attempts to, if you want to call it like that, define some simplified indicators of a very complex system?
Well, I think that puts it really well. It's like simplified indicators of a very complex system that is not very well representative of that complex system. It's like science-like, you know, it looks very technical, but it masks the various value frames that are embedded in it, planetary boundaries in particular, where at the end of the day, it's all these limits and thresholds and themes like that are not workable, but they exist in the model, and they exist as a kind of agenda, I guess, for a select group of people that are pushing world affairs through modeling practices. That's not helpful, at least in my opinion, is puts a handful of people into significant positions of influence and power to define what is good, right, and just. And I don't know, it's not really all that helpful for running nations and moving the global humanity forward in a positive way.
Yeah, I think this is an aspect that also troubles me to a certain extent. I mean, I have the feeling that a lot of these attempts, they look very scientific in the sense of they make complex models and complex forecasts and complex predictions. But often it's very hard to really understand if they mean what they claim they mean, number one. And number two, of course, when you are in the driving seat of these type of frameworks, as you say, then you suddenly get a surprising amount of power, because suddenly you say, yeah, but this is the limit. So, I mean, this is like the scientific limit. And if you don't follow the scientific limit, then you are, I don't know, a bad person or a bad politician or whatnot.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that sort of fascinates me, and it's almost like a side show, but I find it really fascinating, is the discourse around climate anxiety and how it feeds into this planetary boundaries, planetary health kind of realm where you have a particular journal, right, Lancet Planetary Health, which was developed as a means of advocacy for this sort of planetary boundaries crisis narrative, and climate crisis narrative as a whole, and how it affects all these different areas. And then that narrative that things are tragic, we're falling off a cliff, and all bad things, right, starts to become, at least as the story's told, very meaningful and impactful on some group of younger people that start to feel anxious. And then that gets reported in Planetary Health about all these anxious people because they're afraid of the information that's being sold as part of the crisis narrative. And it's just like this weird positive feedback loop where you're spinning this narrative of boundaries and limits and crisis. And then you're saying, look at all these people, they're very anxious because we're not doing anything about this crisis. But it's the messaging that's feeding the anxiety that is then feeding the crisis narrative. And it just goes around and around and around. It is very much like a sideshow to the whole climate policy, energy policy discussion. But it's also a very, to me, kind of fascinating and disturbing sort of manifestation of politics.
I find this a very interesting thought, that this sort of a reinforcing loop in a way that that drives itself to a certain extent. I would like to come back to the story aspect a bit later, but something else seems to me associated with what you said right now, namely the question, what is the role of activism and science? Or let's put it the other way around. Let's say we have activism and we have science. How much overlap should there be? Or should there be no overlap? So I think you could make arguments for two positions. The one position would be, if you're a scientist and you figure out something that might be a problem for society, then it's your duty or something like that, or your responsibility to become an activist and be an activist. So this could be one point. The other aspect could be to say, careful, once you become an activist, you become a bad scientist, because activism is more like a political position, black-white, and you damage your science with this. So how do you see this dilemma?
So it's a complex area. Scientists and researchers broadly, myself included, we're interested in it originates with an interest in society. There's some problem. There's some fascination with a process. There's something that somebody holds dear, right? Not necessarily a problem, but usually people are keen to know more about this thing because they value it, whatever that thing is. And so they go into a field. And so that would be kind of almost like a healthy values perspective. And it's the opportunity to explore, it's the freedom to explore whatever it is that you find interesting. And that's great. The challenge comes then where you care about a thing or you want a particular argument to be made. And so you or whoever the scientist is starts constructing their research in a way that gets them the information that they want to support the argument that they want. And to some extent, that is also not inherently bad, right? Like you're interested in a particular area, and so you're asking questions in a way that inform a debate, that makes it relevant to the policy discourse. But when the actual methods or assumptions are fiddled with, when scientific merit is judged based on the argument that it upholds, that's when you start having really significant problems. That would be an unhealthy way to have your politics and science. And so it's not a clear-cut thing, but you can see when it goes too far one way, when it becomes too politicized, and how that's problematic. And I think there's a lot of ways that scientists can interact in that space in better and worse ways, and understand how to be helpful to policy in explaining where those value-based decisions lie in science and why you get different conflicting truths, right, from science, like conflicting areas of knowledge. It's driven by different value-based assumptions. And that is really helpful for the public discourse, the political discourse about an issue. But it's not, I don't want to say that it's not done often. It's usually not, it's usually not done often. But some do it, and some do it very well. And then by and large, others do not.
My feeling is that, how should I say, science always starts with a question in a way, or with an hypothesis or a thesis. So in a way, the questions that you ask always come from somewhere, obviously, in a way. Mm-hmm. But when you become an activist, my feeling is you're narrowing your vision, and you're narrowing what you think is relevant, and the danger is quite significant that you are only searching stuff that follows sort of this advocacy narrative, if you will. And this might also go hand in hand with the political or political economical angle. By the way, for the listeners, these links will all be in the show notes. You wrote, for instance, a Substack article some time ago about conflicts of interest, and there is a quote in there from you. You say, "Climate change science demonstrates an underappreciated dynamic system of conflicts of interest among climate change researchers, advocacy organizations, and the financial industry." So we have advocacy, we have activism, but we also have like interest from, or maybe pressure from, science organizations, maybe publishing houses, and also meanwhile financial industry.
There's an underappreciated confluence of people doing different things. Scientists are people, and people tend to be citizens, and they have the civic right and to engage with politics and join local chapters and do all sorts of things. As one gains in expertise, they also become sought out as experts, generally paid. And so that's another avenue that somebody might go down, because they, we all work for a living. So a lot of times people are working various different avenues. And it's not inherently bad, but it does need to be made more clear. And so at times we have very notable names in science that also have notable consulting businesses. They have consulting businesses, but more specifically, they have like risk analytic businesses. And those might be set up as NGOs, or they're just set up as their own consulting gig. And so they're consulting, they're moving in between their personal business and then what's going on in politics. Some of them are actively engaged with the administration or a political party. Then they're publishing in the science, and the science is then being used within the business that they run and those that they consult with for. And then it's being used by political interests to make their case, and becomes really messy. And at the very least, I think that the disclosure practices need to be made better in the journal articles. That's like the bottom, right? Like that should be the lowest rung, is we have better disclosure practices. And really, that's a matter of evolving professional ethics within, let's say, the environmental sciences and climate sciences and all that. And it's a practice that's done in medicine and biomedical research. And I'm not saying they don't have any problems, right? They still continue to have conflict of interest problems, but there's a better appreciation for the extent to which the biomedical researchers are working with pharmaceutical industry. At the same time, you have the opportunity to start doing meta-analyses on that research to show to what extent is there funding bias, to what extent is industry influencing the way that we understand a particular drug. And we don't have that opportunity in at least climate sciences, which I've studied, because nobody's reporting anything. And to say they're not reporting anything because they don't have any conflicts is just not true, because there's plenty of publicly accessible information to show that some scientists have rather profound conflicts of interest that should be stated and made public. And that's one of the things, the IPCC doesn't do that, right? So they'll collect conflict of interest information, and then they keep it confidential. And that is not really all that helpful either for the public, because they should know who's writing the report and who they represent.
There's another angle to this, I believe, a sort of a selection criterion also, if you want, like experts that are, let's say, pulled into the public sphere, like in media or even podcasts and so on, tend to be outspoken people and people who often have a rather one-dimensional message. It reminds me to one of your former US presidents. I don't know who it was. He would like to have a one-armed economist. And he said, why you do want a one-armed economist? He says, because every time when I'm asking an economist about an opinion, he says on the one hand this, on the other hand this. And so, like as a joke, obviously. But I think that's quite an important thing. Like, I mean, science, in any complex topic, usually there are conflicting topics or conflicting momentum or whatever you want. And if you simplify it to one simple narrative, and this is obviously then amplified by media who wants a short and snappy message, then this also selects for the wrong people, no?
Yeah, I'd say that it's even deeper than that, right? Or much more subtle, maybe. It's deeper and subtle. When scientists do not acknowledge where there's conflict in information, like real conflict, not like, is the earth round or not, right? Like some people believe so, some people, but like real ways in which expert judgment might lead to different conclusions. They're putting the thumb on the scale of the information that policymakers have to meet the needs and demands of the public. And that is really what kind of is most disconcerting, because it undermines standard democratic process. At the same time, it's tricky, right? Because we're a technological society. We have a lot of information. We expect our policymakers to engage with experts and scientists. But we don't expect those experts and scientists to usurp the process of decision-making or to kind of capture it. Whoever the experts are that are being consulted control the information and the assumptions that are available to policymakers to use to make decisions, then it does limit the public's ability to be heard and for a diverse range of interests to be represented. To some degree, sometimes policymakers will do that intentionally, so it doesn't look like they're the ones that are making a choice. It's just the information that they have that supports the decision that they wanted to make to begin with. I mean, to some extent, that's just life, but it would be helpful for scientists and the experts that are being consulted to be more explicit and transparent and to do what they can. And this is also sort of like a professional ethics where researchers should be more accustomed, or at least become more aware of the ways in which they can, or that they should be pushing responsibility for decision making back to those that have the will of the public to do so. They should always be saying, here are your options, here are your options, here are your options, not, I think you should do A and only A.
But that's actually very interesting, because what you're suggesting here, and I think this, I would agree with that, is that experts could come into, or maybe are in many cases, in the role of sort of unelected politicians. Because when I, as an expert, limit the information to you as a politician, then I'm sort of making a judgment already beforehand. Not to mention that we recently was a Nature article about the Planetary Boundaries, which was in the end full with political suggestions and recommendations. And this would be the point where I feel that's an overstep for scientists.
To provide recommendations, or? Yeah,
especially political ones, like how you should act economically, or how you should do this and that.
You might say, like, here are some options to achieve X that are consistent with the state of knowledge. I don't know. But planetary boundaries is like this whole other world, right? Like the extent to which that narrative and that framework has become an empire. I was thinking about it the other day. I'm like, it's not so much as a franchise, but almost like a brand. And this idea, this planetary boundaries framework and then it got linked on to tipping point, and then it became this kind of like branding thing. And there's been all these different sort of, I don't know, almost like financial ideas, activities going under it. But it's in and of itself like I don't know, it's a collection of researchers that kind of was like, isn't this a cool thing? and it very much is a brand. They created some sort of modeling framework. They then turned around and sold as
operational tool.
And really what's underneath it, the way it's become operationalized is at least as I understand it, is very much of it's almost like an investment regime. There are other problems with the way that it's been delivered, like the business model behind all this. It became housed very closely with climate modeling in general. The way that climate modeling is organized, or let's say, how would you say it? Earth modeling is organized, is very close in proximity. It's housed under the same Future Earth institution as now this like Earth Commission, Planetary Boundaries, financial regime. It's like it's too close together. And some of those people too are incredibly influential in the IPCC, and not just modeling assumptions that go into how we produce climate projections, but then also like underlying socioeconomic assumptions that go into producing climate projections, but then also the alternatives available for addressing climate change. And so you have, again, like this very small network of people that like are constantly moving between their business interests and political activities, and then they're sitting on very influential assessment groups. It's like a little empire, and it's not so great. It's not so healthy.
This opens up another question for me, which is actually also by recent events a little bit triggered, and I'm personally quite unhappy about the quality issues we have in large areas of science. I had a conversation with John Ioannidis recently, and I'm happy to say that John Ioannidis is going to be on the podcast in a few months, I hope. So this will be very interesting. John Ioannidis researched largely in the medical and pharmaceutical field, but not only, also in other fields. And so let's say his results about the quality of scientific papers is not great. Not his assessment. The results of his assessment. So we have some significant issues, and this seems not to stop in pharmaceutics or medical science. It also goes into environmental science. Like, for instance, Roger Pilker Jr., as you know, wrote a lot about like hurricane predictions or hurricane effects that were at least, let's say, maybe not stated as the facts really are. And also political leanings of science magazines, which really trouble me a lot. For instance, I think you even tweeted this yesterday, the Scientific American editor who posted some, let's say, quite extraordinary tweets about the US election. Everyone can have his or her opinion about the election, obviously. But when you're an editor of a scientific magazine, I think you should be a bit careful of what messages you're sending. Scientific American even promoted one presidential candidate. So did Science, I think, did so. Science definitely had some years ago when Marcia McNutt was the editor-in-chief. She had an editorial where she wrote, "The time for debate has ended," about climate change. So now, what does this mean? You're the editor of one of the most influential magazines, and you say that the debate has ended. So this clearly sends a signal to scientists who have to publish in this magazine, no?
Yeah. So colleague Patrick Brown has written quite a bit about this, sort of fitting the narrative in order to get into these prestigious journals, and then the impact if you're framing your research questions in a way that helps you get into these elite journals, and the elite journals are fitting the narrative of their editors, then the back effect is that the research that we have is really the research that feeds the editor's political preferences, which is
again a feedback loop, as you mentioned before, right?
Yeah. There's so much research of various qualities. Some of it's not so great. Some of it's interesting, but not all that useful. and some of it's really good. So one of the things that my students this semester have really struggled with is like, how do you figure out what to trust? And that's really a problem when the spokespeople, I guess, representing science, like big S science, starts to show their hand as advocating for this or that political position, then it starts to eat away at the way the public at large has their trust in science. And that's a problem, right? So it's a problem because science is like a rudder. It's a means for us to know how the way the world works, where there are things that we don't know. It's a really useful way to hold policymakers accountable because you have empirical knowledge. You have some idea of like the way future might unfold if one decision is made over another. But if that is being undermined by both the way scientists are conducting themselves and then also that feeding back on eroding public trust in science, then it's not just science that gets brought down. It's all of our other institutions that are important for democracy, for social stability, for all sorts of stuff. And so, yes, editors need to conduct themselves a little bit better. Scientists need to conduct themselves a little bit better. And that stuff with, I'm forgetting her name, but the editor for the Scientific American, my goodness, even if your social media feed is your own opinions, you're kind of a public figure. That's a big magazine, Scientific American. So you can't.
And also you show your political leaning. And if I'm the editor and I'm having a very clear political leaning and very clear ideas, then if I'm on the other side, a scientist who wants to publish in my magazine, I mean, it sends a very clear signal, does it not?
Yeah. For years, there has been commentary for years. I want to say that I became aware of it in the early 2000s, but there's been commentary that as they increasingly solidify as one political leaning, it won't create generative knowledge because everybody's agreeing with each other on ideological grounds rather than you need that disagreement to inspire new questions and new ways of researching and developing knowledge. If people are not in line with your politics, they're not going to want to hear about it. And that's no good. Not, at least if you're producing science.
It just reminds me of something that is disconcerting for me. It's just something very recent because I'm just finishing my book and I used some parts of text that I wrote 5 or more years ago. And I researched at that time and I just put them in. And then when I did proofreading, I thought, okay, let's check if these assumptions that are in there is still correct. And it was honestly a shock to me that I had to cut out 3 significant things that were established scientific facts from 5, 6, 7 years ago that simply didn't hold anymore. And I did not quote like some fringe journal article from, something. I give you one example. There was this topic of the radon gas, which is not a political issue, like radon gas that that comes from rock formations and can come into your cellar of your house. So, and obviously radon gas is radioactive, so you don't want to inhale too much of it because it can inflict your health and your lungs. So, and there were several books 5 to 10 years ago that mentioned the number that every year in the US and Europe, 40,000 people, 40,000 would die from radon gas exposure. Every year. I mean, that's quite a substantial number, right? Mm-hmm. And I had this number in my text because it was in 2 books. And then I thought, okay, let's check this again to be on the safe side. And 2 funny things happened. Number one, I asked an AI about this, and the AI said, yes, 40,000, and gave me a reference. The reference was good, but the reference did actually say, no, it's not 40,000. So the AI made it wrong, as usual. So it's the usual AI nonsense. But in this article, this recent article and others, there was mentioned, this 40,000 number was like circulating some years ago, but it's not substantiated by anything. So I'm wondering what the heck? And this number came from, I don't know, some high-ranked organizations. I don't know if it was WHO or some US organization. This shocks me because this is not like some fringe argument that was made 10 years ago. This was like a common statement. And I had this on 3 significant occasions. It really troubles me.
So I'm not familiar with that particular study.
It's not about this. It was just one of several examples.
So knowledge evolves, assuming that there was good integrity in that study where that number came from or whatever. But science evolves. Like the things that we know, the things that we think that we know change over time. And we learn new stuff and we discard old ideas. And that is totally okay. And science should be working that way. Some things stand the test of time, right? And that's great. Some things don't. And we change our models. We're able to change. The problem that comes is when we know better and that knowledge, that new knowledge is suppressed in order to hold on to an old idea that is outdated, but is politically expedient. That is no good. Knowledge should evolve. And when we learn new things, we move forward with that new information.
I totally agree with that. And that would not be my issue. But my issue is the topics that I had were more like in the category where I would say, after researching that the original claim was way too strong. I think what you said is totally valid, and often new ideas are suppressed because they don't fit some story or some political leaning, whatever. But I have the feeling that we so often have actually rather shaky knowledge, and we present them as this would be the fact, and that's how we have to go. And this is very troubling to me.
So, but this feeds into, I guess, the way I would think about it is that we all work for a living, right? Scientists, researchers, academics, I don't know, people in general, right? Like here I am on a podcast, like people get strokes, like they get big strokes, ego strokes. Oh, look at how great you are. When they end up in the public venue, when they get invited to do an editorial in a major media outlet, when they get invited by heads of state to testify. But a lot of that is driven by attention. And so there is a institutional, professional incentive to make big claims in order to draw attention. So you end up drawing attention. And what's happening now a lot is people draw attention. They get all these hits on their paper. They end up in the media. Newspapers go wild because there's some sort of latest catastrophe of some kind. And then very subtly, a month or so later, there's like a slight change to the paper that makes it a little less dramatic.
But that, of course, doesn't get the attention of the previous one.
Yeah, no, right. But the damage has already been done. And that happens with like big papers that end up retracted and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, there's an incentive to make big claims. That's what we get rewarded for as professors, as researchers, is big claims. Nobody gets rewarded for, I found this not so surprising, subtle change. So, yeah,
I totally get it. And this sort of rewarding big claims and attention, I think it's very devastating for science in a way. I mean, I just recently researched, like there was this, just as a side note, there was like about 15 or 20 years ago, this German physicist, Jan Hendrik Schön, practically all of his papers were withdrawn in the end because they were, how do you say, forged, not forged, how do you say when you make up data and make up stuff. So,
falsified?
Yeah, there's something like that, exactly. But the interesting part was not so much that this guy had a scientific misconduct. The really interesting part for me was that he had, I think in over 2 years, he had something like 10 papers in Science and Nature. And on top of that, a number of others. So he had a paper every week, if you counted that, in the top journals, and I'm wondering what on earth is going on in the journals. You know what I mean? You publish 10 of his papers in the 2 or 3 top journals, and none of these people get like suspicious or should we maybe check this a bit closer because it came out because some other physicist who was not in the review process or anything just checked this and said, how can this be like these 2 diagrams are the same, what have you, something like that. So it was revealed from outside. And these things trouble me because clearly the structure that should guarantee the quality is not even able to, I don't know, detect such obvious scams.
Yeah, I think another underappreciated thing, at least these days, I don't know how long it's been going on, but academic publishing or research publishing is also a business. It has become a big business. And it turns media headlines. The journals have access. They push it through social media. They set up reporters to report it. They engage with that entire media sphere. And that influences what we get. Because if the publishing houses, right, if the publishing houses are focused on attention getting and marketing and advertising and that activity, then they're going to look for those big claims. They're going to look for authors that can draw that sort of attention, right? If they put out a paper by X famous guy, then they get more hits or clicks, if you will. It doesn't make everything that big journals publish bad, but it does create an incentive to push ideas that are not necessarily the most helpful ideas for addressing public problems. I have found that there is an underappreciation for the extent to which scholarly publishing is a business, a big media business. It's not just all good moral virtue around skill and enlightenment. It's money, fame, and fortune. So it's yet another one of those things that the public should be more aware of. Some people are, but not in a general sense.
Maybe to wrap up a topic that we started earlier. I mean, I had several episodes about modeling and the limits of modeling and all of that, but maybe just to get your perspective briefly. So how would you, I don't know, if people listen to this podcast that are maybe not scientists, that are just, are confronted with model or model results in media or even decision makers, let's say politicians. So what would be your recommendation of the proper use of models, if you will, and also the proper communication about what the models do?
I think I recently had Andreas Saltelli, if I pronounce his last name properly, in my class. He's a scholar in Spain, and he was talking about big models in my class and the ethics of them. And the things that we claim to be doing with models, they deserve to have a better interrogation of claims in respect to what they actually do in practice and also the ethics of it. There's political assumptions embedded and all that. And political repercussions too. If we're claiming to know something for certain that is just not true, that's not what that model does. That's a problem. But at the same time, we're a technologically advanced society. We use models, and models can be incredibly useful for suggesting future outcomes given specific assumptions. And when you use a suite of models, you can say, oh, this model looks like it performs better in this way, but not that way. You can start to assess the technology. So it should be a more dynamic practice with better clarifications about the assumptions or embedded in the practice, rather than taking some very complex model or a collection of them, averaging them together and saying, this is what will be. Or where you have different groups coming in and saying, I have the best model. Let me tell you about what will be. It's more accurate. It's more sophisticated. It's when really a lot of them are playing within some same range of uncertainty, and they're hitting a midpoint that is more appealing to their market versus another modeling company that has a different section of the market and they like different numbers. So it's not that they're bad. Again, they can be incredibly useful. We know more about our Earth, the Earth dynamics. We know more about what current and future climate might look like and how things interact together. But to say that we know what will be, to say that we know exactly how to get to where we want to be, it's not being honest about how these things work. And there was a statement somewhere. There's a good book. It's called, it's sitting right here, Escape from Model Land by Erica Thompson.
I had Erica Thompson on the podcast, yeah.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. She has this, to take a model literally is not to take them seriously.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's her quote or somebody or something she got from somewhere else. But I thought it was brilliant and exactly this point. Like, the models are useful for giving us some ideas, but the specificity is not where we should focus.
Let me try to rephrase what you said, and you tell me if you agree. The use of models should be more like a scenario building thing, so where you might use different models, maybe different parameterization, what have you, to get an idea of how the situation could be, like scenario building. And in that sense, models would help you to simply come to better questions, to better ask questions, maybe something like that, but not as a prognostication tool, at least not, let's say, when we forget about some very specific models like weather models and we know they are rather good within 24 hours or something like that. Okay, then we have some, empirical knowledge that this will be good enough for, I don't know, air traffic or what have you. But these are rather exceptions, because when you see what economic models do is you see that they're always wrong practically. I mean, I haven't seen larger scale models like they can't even predict the 2 quarters in the future properly. So, I mean, it seems you never learn from that, right? And this also brings me to another aspect, namely risk management. I'm really troubled about that aspect, because when you give people the impression that you can predict the future or prognosticate the future properly, you actually might increase the risk dramatically, because you give people a false sense of maybe security or even false sense of what you're supposed to do, which you probably don't have to because the model is wrong anyway.
I mean, yeah, I would agree with you. There's a freedom in uncertainty. And there's also a opportunity to create decisions that are more robust to an unpredictable future. But the more that we say we're certain, we want this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, usually in order to support a preferred policy preference, the more vulnerable we become to the uncertainty that we're pretending is not there.
I think that's exactly much better said. Yeah, exactly. That was the point I wanted to come to. I would like to maybe close with something that you mentioned in the beginning already, namely stories for the future, because like we could end with the future, so to speak. And you also wrote recently, I think it was recently, a Substack article, Unhinged, about climate anxiety and about anxious kids and what have you. And this is something that, I mean, kids is just one example, but I'm wondering, what do we think that our society can achieve when we scare children to death? I mean, who works on a positive future when you are scared like hell, right? I mean, is this the right way to go, or what type of stories should we aim for? I mean, we shouldn't lie to people, obviously, because just to say, oh, everything's nice and dandy is probably also not good if it's not. But how do we balance that out?
Yeah, there's a lot of times where I'm sort of baffled sometimes by the, like, look at these hurricanes, look at the flooding, and maybe there's something wrong with me. But I'm like, well, what if it's a very dynamic and somewhat volatile place? So, like, these things happen. They've been happening for a long time. How we choose to deal with them and how we should be constructing our communities in ways that deal with them better, rather than looking at them and saying, like, how could this be? It's like, well, because we all live on Earth for now, and that's where we've been living. And we're also, as a society, as a global society, it has not all been rainbows and unicorns. Like, we have had wars and we have had really awful things happen. And thankfully, we have had less of them as time goes on, and people are doing better with dealing with extreme weather, and we have more medicines. Children are living to see adulthood when that was not always the case. There's lots of good there. And that there is also problems. We have serious problems. We have concerns. We should be concerned about security and economic development. We should be concerned about poverty. We should be concerned about war. We should be concerned about a lot of things. I don't know, though, that that's necessarily new, right? It's part of the human condition, and it's part of learning, and that enlightenment piece about learning about what's going on in the rest of the world and being a caring individual, if not a species, right? So we're trying to care for others. We care about what happens. And so it's balancing that story. And I feel like that's almost like, I mean, it's almost biblical, right? Like it's part of who we are, where we're constantly trying to advance the good and provide better opportunities for not just mankind, but all living beings, great and small. And then also dealing with the challenges and sort of the ugly things that humanity also creates, like conflict and repercussions to our political decisions that lead to famine. That's a terrible thing. So in other words, in creating the story, it's looking towards the good, accepting that it's not all great, and continuing to try and do good and be good and moving forward. That's what I think. That's what I try to do with my child, is honest and positive.
Yeah, it seems to me that probably this was always a human thing. I don't know. But it seems to me that we are wildly over-focusing on some risks or some particular risks. Like I had Johan Norberg, one of the recent episodes, and he said, when you see what we achieved over the last 150 years in terms of like longevity, or I always like to bring the example of Calvin Coolidge's son, he was the son of the president of the United States, and he died with 17 on an infection after a tennis match because there were simply no antibiotics. Like the son of the president of the United States dies from a blister on the foot. I mean, this wouldn't happen today, not even to a poor person. You would go to the hospital and would get some, I don't know, shot or some, I don't know how you get it administered. Anyway, so there are so many things that got better. And Johan Norberg said our problems are also, have higher level problems, if you will, and we should not ignore the problems. But of course, we solved so many others, or at least made them better. Such a story should encapsulate the whole picture, not only part of it, no?
Yeah, climate change is real, and there's a part of it that we play a big role in, and it's serious and it should be addressed, and that is important. To spend the amount of time that we do talking about climate change and the extent to which it's taken over everything that we talk about is, in my opinion, a reflection of some serious privilege and wealth. that this is the concern in all things for all people is climate change. And it's really kind of an elitist stance to be that consumed with that piece of the world's problems. And it's not to demean the importance of climate change, but you have to have nothing else going on to be that concerned about it. or not nothing else going on. You have to have not the other problems. And so I do think it's become all-encompassing in a bad way. And it also is not the way to address it. The way to address it is to address the other underlying issues and to bring people the things that they need to have the opportunity to then think about these larger, higher order sort of value goals that they aspire to have. Like one might aspire to have the problem of climate change rather than the daily problem of food costs or food availability or job security, you know.
Jessica, I think this is a very good ending for our conversation. Thank you very much for the conversation.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on the show.